In the heart of Ember Hollow, where the air hums with the whispers of ancient magic, a young mage named Cael stands before the Emberstone, a relic older than memory itself. Its surface pulses faintly, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, and as Cael reaches out to touch it, a warmth unlike anything he's ever known spreads through his fingertips, coursing through his veins like liquid fire. In that moment, something dormant within him stirs, awakening a power he never knew he possessed. But this gift comes with a warning. The village elder speaks of a shadow creeping closer, drawn to the Emberstone's light, and Cael finds himself at a crossroads. To run would mean safety, but to stay would mean stepping into a destiny he can barely comprehend. The flicker of the stone seems to whisper secrets of battles to come, of flames that will either forge him or consume him. What will he choose, and what will the Emberstone reveal about the darkness that looms just beyond the horizon? Cael stood in the clearing, his hands trembling as faint embers danced across his palms. The elder, a stooped figure with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom, watched him closely. "Focus, Cael," the elder said, his voice steady and calm. "The flames are a part of you, but they do not rule you. You must learn to guide them, not fight them." Cael clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing, but the fire within him felt wild, unpredictable. Each flicker of flame seemed to carry its own will, refusing to bend to his command. The first few attempts were clumsy, bursts of heat erupting from his hands in erratic waves. One moment, the flames would sputter and die. The next, they would roar to life with startling intensity. During one particularly intense session, Cael lost control entirely. A surge of fire leapt from his fingertips, igniting the dry grass of a nearby field. Panic surged through him as the flames spread, crackling and devouring the earth in their path. The elder moved swiftly, murmuring an incantation to quell the blaze, but the damage was done. As the smoke curled into the sky, a strange unease settled over the clearing. Cael felt it before he saw it, a shift in the air, a presence watching from the shadows of the forest. His gaze darted toward the tree line, where dark figures lingered just beyond the light. They were barely visible, their forms blending into the gloom, but their eyes gleamed with an unnatural sharpness. The elder's hand tightened on Cael's shoulder. "Do not look too long," he warned, his voice low. "They are drawn to power, and you are not yet ready to face them." But Cael couldn't help himself. The figures fascinated him, their movements deliberate and silent, like specters haunting the edge of his world. Who were they? What did they want? The elder's warnings echoed in his mind, but curiosity burned brighter than fear. He found himself stealing glances at the forest, his thoughts consumed by the mystery of those shadowy watchers. The elder sighed, recognizing the spark of determination in Cael's eyes. "Curiosity is a dangerous companion," he said, his tone heavy with caution. "It can lead you to truths you are not prepared to face. But if you insist on pursuing this path, you must be stronger than your doubts and smarter than your enemies." Cael nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead. The flames within him still flickered with uncertainty, but something else had begun to stir, a resolve to uncover the secrets of the forest, no matter the cost. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing, Cael felt the weight of the elder's words settle over him. The fire in his hands was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in the darkness beyond, where the line between ally and enemy blurred, and the whispers of the Emberstone grew louder with every passing moment. Cael stepped into the forest, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots, the only sound breaking the silence. The air felt different here, thicker, heavier, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. His heart pounded, not just from the exertion of walking, but from the weight of the unknown. The figures he'd seen lingered in his mind, their eerie stillness and piercing eyes haunting his thoughts. He knew the elder had warned him against this, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to close in around him. Shadows stretched long and twisted, and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind sounded almost like whispers. Just as doubt began to creep in, a low, pained whine cut through the stillness. Cael froze, his instincts prickling. He followed the sound cautiously, his breath shallow, until he found the source. A wolf, its fur matted with blood, lying motionless beneath a gnarled oak. Its eyes, though clouded with pain, burned with an amber glow that seemed to pierce through the dim light of the forest. Cael hesitated, his hand hovering over the creature. He'd never used his magic to heal before, but the fire within him stirred, as if responding to the wolf's silent plea. Closing his eyes, he focused on the warmth in his chest, willing it to flow through his hands. The flames that usually danced erratically now flickered with a gentle, steady light, spreading over the wolf's wounds like liquid sunlight. The effect was immediate. The wolf's breathing steadied, and its amber eyes brightened, locking onto Cael's with an intensity that made his breath catch. Before he could react, the creature began to change. Its form shimmered, dissolving into a swirl of golden light that coalesced into a new shape, a figure both familiar and otherworldly. The spirit guide stood before him, its presence radiating an ancient, almost reverent energy. "You have awakened the Emberstone's power," the guide said, its voice echoing faintly, as if carried on the wind. "But this is only the beginning. The stone is tied to a prophecy older than the forest itself, a prophecy that speaks of a mage who will either save this world or see it consumed by the shadows that gather at its edges." Cael's mind raced, torn between awe and disbelief. A prophecy, him. The idea felt too grand, too impossible, but the weight of the guide's words pressed down on him like a stone. The Emberstone's whispers, the shadowy figures, the strange pull he felt toward the forest. It all began to make a terrible kind of sense. The guide tilted its head, studying him with those glowing amber eyes. "You stand at a crossroads, mage. To return to the village is to choose safety, but it is also to turn away from your destiny. To follow me is to step into the unknown, where danger and truth walk hand in hand. The choice is yours." Cael stared at the spirit, his mind a whirlwind of questions and fears. The village was safe, familiar, a place where he could learn to control his magic without the weight of prophecy pressing down on him. But the forest called to him, its secrets whispering promises of answers he couldn't ignore. He took a deep breath, the warmth of the Emberstone pulsing faintly in his chest. The path ahead was shrouded in shadows, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of resolve. Whatever lay beyond the trees, he knew one thing for certain. The flames within him were no longer just a gift, they were a responsibility. And whether he was ready or not, the choice he made here would shape not just his fate, but the fate of the world itself. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Cael followed the spirit wolf, its golden form gliding effortlessly through the dense undergrowth. The air grew warmer with every step, the faint hum of the Emberstone's energy pulsing in sync with his heartbeat. It was as if the forest itself was alive, guiding him towards something unseen yet deeply felt. The trees began to thin, revealing a hidden grove bathed in an ethereal light. Here, the Emberstone's power was undeniable. Its energy thrummed through the ground, through the air, through Cael himself. In the center of the grove stood a figure, her back turned as she examined a cluster of glowing crystals embedded in the earth. She wore a cloak of deep green, its edges frayed and singed, and her movements were deliberate, almost reverent. Cael hesitated, his instincts on edge, but the spirit wolf stepped forward, its amber eyes fixed on the stranger. The figure turned, revealing sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "You've come a long way to find this place," she said, her voice smooth but laced with caution. "I'm Lyra, and you must be the one the Emberstone has chosen." Cael tensed, his hand instinctively brushing the pouch at his side where the stone rested. "How do you know about the Emberstone?" Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained serious. "Because I've spent years trying to protect it, and failing. There's a warlock, a man who calls himself Malachar, who seeks to corrupt its power. He's been gathering followers, twisting their minds to serve his cause. If he succeeds, the Emberstone won't just be a relic of the past, it will become a weapon of destruction." Her words hung in the air, heavy with urgency, but something about her tone made Cael uneasy. He studied her carefully, noting the way her gaze flickered to the spirit wolf, as if gauging its reaction. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Lyra stepped closer, her expression softening. "Because I've seen what Malachar is capable of. He doesn't just want power, he wants to unravel the very fabric of this world. And if you don't believe me, look around you. The grove, the crystals, the spirit that led you here, they're all part of a greater design, one that connects you to the Emberstone in ways you can't yet understand." Cael's gaze drifted to the crystals, their light pulsing in time with the stone at his side. The connection was undeniable, but so was the doubt gnawing at the edges of his mind. Lyra's warning was compelling, yet her motives remained shrouded in mystery. Was she truly an ally, or was there more to her story than she let on? The spirit wolf let out a low growl, its golden form flickering faintly. Cael glanced at it, searching for some sign of guidance, but the creature's expression was unreadable. He turned back to Lyra, his thoughts racing. If Malachar is as dangerous as you say, why hasn't anyone stopped him before now? Lyra's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet resolve. "Because no one has ever wielded the Emberstone's power the way you can. You're not just a mage, Cael. You're a catalyst. But that also makes you a target. Malachar will come for you, and when he does, you'll need more than raw power to stand against him." The weight of her words settled over him, mingling with the hum of the grove's energy. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but it was also filled with possibility. Cael could feel the Emberstone's warmth, a constant reminder of the power he carried and the responsibility that came with it. As the light of the grove began to dim, casting long shadows across the clearing, Cael knew one thing for certain. The choices he made now would shape not just his destiny, but the fate of everything he held dear. And whether Lyra was a friend or a foe, her warning was a spark that had already ignited something deep within him, a determination to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. Cael and Lyra moved through the forest in tense silence, the weight of their uneasy alliance hanging between them like an unspoken question. The spirit wolf had vanished, leaving Cael to navigate the path ahead with only Lyra's cryptic guidance. She moved with a practiced ease, her eyes scanning the shadows as if expecting danger at every turn. Though her presence was reassuring in some ways, Cael couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she'd revealed. The ruins of the ancient temple loomed ahead, their jagged silhouette cutting through the twilight like broken teeth. Time had worn away much of the structure, but the faint glow of the Emberstone's energy pulsed through the cracks in the stone, a reminder of the power that still lingered here. Cael felt it in his chest, a low, resonant hum that seemed to pull him forward, as if the temple itself was calling to him. Lyra paused at the edge of the ruins, her gaze fixed on the crumbling entrance. "This is where it all began," she said quietly. "The Emberstone was forged here, long before the forest grew around it. If we're going to understand its power, we need to find the chamber where it was first awakened." Cael nodded, though the idea of stepping into the temple's depths sent a shiver down his spine. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old magic, and the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, as if they were alive. He took a deep breath, his hand brushing the pouch at his side. The stone's warmth was steady, a small comfort in the face of the unknown. They had barely crossed the threshold when the first attack came. A low growl echoed through the ruins, followed by the sound of footsteps, too many to count. Dark shapes emerged from the shadows, their eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. The Warlocks Minions. Cael's heart raced as they closed in, their movements unnervingly coordinated. "Stay close," Lyra said, her voice tight with urgency. She raised her hands, and a shimmering barrier of light sprang up around them, deflecting the first wave of attacks. Cael didn't have time to think. The flames within him surged to life, hotter and brighter than ever before. He threw out his hands, and a wall of fire erupted between them and their attackers. The heat was intense, the flames roaring with a life of their own. But the minions didn't retreat. They pressed forward, their forms twisting and shifting as they passed through the fire unharmed. Panic clawed at the edges of Cael's mind, but he forced himself to focus. The Emberstone's energy pulsed in his chest, steady and insistent. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth guide him. When he opened them again, the flames had changed. They burned with a golden hue, brighter and purer than before. This time, when he unleashed them, the minions recoiled, their forms dissolving into ash. The battle was over as quickly as it had begun, but Cael's strength was spent. He sank to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Lyra knelt beside him, her expression unreadable. "You did well," she said after a moment, "but this is only the beginning. Malachar's minions won't stop coming, and the deeper we go, the more dangerous it will become." Cael looked up at her, his exhaustion warring with a growing sense of determination. "Then we'd better keep moving," he said, pushing himself to his feet. The ruins stretched out before them, dark and foreboding, but Cael felt a strange sense of clarity. The battle had shown him the true extent of his power, and the cost of using it. He wasn't just a mage anymore. He was a guardian, a protector of something far greater than himself. And as he stepped deeper into the temple, the Emberstone's light guiding his way, he knew that whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the flames of his own resolve, burning brighter than ever. The air inside the temple was heavy, thick with the scent of ancient stone and the faint metallic tang of old magic. Cael's footsteps echoed softly as he and Lyra moved deeper into the ruins, the light from the Emberstone casting flickering shadows on the walls. The temple was a labyrinth of crumbling halls and forgotten chambers, but something about it felt alive, as if the very stones were watching them. As they turned a corner, Lyra stopped abruptly, her sharp eyes scanning the walls. "Look," she said, her voice low. Cael followed her gaze to a series of intricate carvings etched into the stone. The images were faded, worn by time, but their meaning was unmistakable. A massive figure wreathed in flames loomed over smaller, cowering shapes, its form radiating power and destruction. Above it, a glowing orb of the Emberstone hovered, its light encircling the fiery figure in chains of light. Cael stepped closer, his heart pounding as he traced the lines of the carving with his fingers. This is the Emberstone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And this thing, this fire demon, it's what the stone was made to seal away." Lyra nodded, her expression grim. The Warlock's plan makes sense now. He doesn't just want the Emberstone's power. He wants to unseal the demon and use it for himself. If he succeeds, nothing will stand in his way. The weight of her words settled over Cael like a storm cloud. He'd known the Emberstone was important, but this was something else entirely. The stone wasn't just a relic. It was a lock, holding back a force of destruction that could consume the world. And now, that lock was in his hands. Lyra turned to him, her blue eyes piercing. "There's another way," she said. "We could destroy the Emberstone. If it's gone, the demon will remain sealed, and the Warlock will have nothing to unleash." Cael stared at her, his mind reeling. Destroy the stone. It felt unthinkable, like severing a part of himself. The warmth of the Emberstone pulsed in his chest, a constant reminder of the power it held, and the connection they shared. "No," he said firmly, "the stone is more than just a seal. It's a source of balance, of protection. If we destroy it, we lose that. There has to be another way." Lyra's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. "You're risking everything by keeping it," she said, her voice sharp. "If the Warlock gets his hands on the stone, the demon will be unleashed, and it will be on you." Cael clenched his fists, the flames within him flickering in response to his rising frustration. "And if we destroy it, we might be dooming ourselves to a worse fate. The Emberstone isn't just a weapon, it's a tool. We can use it to stop the Warlock, to protect what's left of this world." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken words and the weight of their disagreement. Lyra's gaze softened, but her resolve remained. "I hope you're right," she said quietly, "but if you're not, The consequences will be unimaginable. Kael looked back at the carvings, the image of the fire demon burning itself into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the stone's power was tied to something greater, something he didn't yet understand. But one thing was clear: the path ahead was fraught with danger, and the choices they made would shape the fate of everything they held dear. As they moved deeper into the temple, the air grew warmer, the hum of the Emberstone's energy resonating with the ancient stones. Kael could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, but beneath it was a flicker of determination. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the flames of his own resolve burning brighter than ever. The tension between Kael and Lyra crackled in the air like a storm on the verge of breaking. She stood before him, her arms crossed, her expression unyielding. "This is your last chance," she said, her voice low but firm. "Destroy the stone, and we can end this before it begins. Keep it, and you risk everything." Kael's grip tightened around the Emberstone, its warmth a steady presence against his palm. "I can't," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "This power, it's not just a weapon, it's a part of me. If we destroy it, we're giving up before we've even tried to fight." Lyra's eyes flashed with frustration, but beneath it, Kael thought he saw something else: fear, perhaps, or regret. "You're making a mistake," she said, her tone sharp, "and I won't stand by and watch you doom us all." With that, she turned on her heel and strode away, her footsteps echoing through the ancient halls of the temple. Kael watched her go, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He wanted to call out to stop her, but the words caught in his throat. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, heavier than ever. Alone now, Kael pressed forward, the flickering light of the Emberstone guiding his way. The temple's corridors twisted and turned, their walls lined with carvings that seemed to shift and change as he passed. He could feel the weight of centuries pressing in around him, the air thick with the hum of ancient magic. It wasn't long before the first trap sprang. A low click echoed through the hall, and Kael barely had time to throw himself to the side as a volley of arrows shot from hidden slots in the walls. He landed hard, the breath knocked from his lungs, but he forced himself to his feet, his heart pounding. The traps grew more frequent and more deadly the deeper he went. Blades swung from the ceiling, pits opened beneath his feet, and strange, glowing runes flared to life, sending bursts of energy crackling through the air. Each obstacle forced him to think quickly, to rely on his instincts and the power of the Emberstone. But as the challenges mounted, so did his doubts. The stone's energy was a constant presence, pulsing in time with his heartbeat, but it felt different now, more volatile, harder to control. He could feel it responding to his emotions, flaring brighter with every surge of fear or frustration. Was the stone's power truly his to command, or was it twisting him, shaping him into something he didn't recognize? The thought gnawed at him as he pressed on, his resolve wavering with every step. The temple seemed endless, its halls stretching on into darkness, and the weight of his isolation grew heavier with each passing moment. He couldn't shake the image of Lyra walking away, her words echoing in his mind. Was he being reckless? Was his attachment to the stone blinding him to the risks? A sudden sound broke through his thoughts, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down his spine. Cael froze, his eyes scanning the shadows ahead. The growl came again, closer this time, and he realized with a sinking feeling that he wasn't alone. From the darkness emerged a creature unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its form was twisted, its body a patchwork of scales and fur, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It moved with a strange, jerky gait, as if it were pieced together from parts that didn't quite fit. Cael's breath caught in his throat as the creature lunged, its claws slashing through the air. He barely managed to dodge, his movements fueled by adrenaline and instinct. The flames within him surged to life, but they felt wilder now, harder to control. He threw out his hands, and a wall of fire erupted between him and the creature, but it barely slowed it down. The creature charged through the flames, its form twisting and shifting as it closed the distance. Cael stumbled back, his mind racing. He could feel the Emberstone's energy pulsing in his chest, but it was growing harder to focus, harder to keep it in check. As the creature pressed its attack, Cael's doubts surged to the surface. Was this what Lyra had warned him about? Was the stone's power too much for him to handle? The thought sent a pang of fear through him, but beneath it was something else, a flicker of determination. He couldn't give up now, not when so much was at stake. With a deep breath, he forced himself to focus, to channel the stone's energy with precision rather than brute force. The flames in his hands shifted, their light growing steadier, more controlled. When the creature lunged again, Cael was ready. He unleashed a concentrated burst of fire, the flames burning with a golden hue that seemed to pierce through the creature's twisted form. It let out a final, guttural cry before collapsing, its body dissolving into ash. Cael sank to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The battle had left him drained, but it had also given him clarity. The Emberstone's power was a double-edged sword, but it was his to wield. He just had to learn how to use it wisely. As he rose to his feet, the temple's halls seemed less foreboding, the darkness less oppressive. The path ahead was still uncertain, but Cael knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let doubt cloud his judgment. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the flames of his own resolve, tempered by the lessons he'd learned in the temple's depths. The air grew heavier as Cael stepped into the temple's inner sanctum, the walls closing in around him like the jaws of some ancient beast. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow, but what caught his attention was the mural that dominated the far wall. It stretched from floor to ceiling, its colors faded but still vivid enough to tell a story of sacrifice and despair. At the center of the mural stood a figure wreathed in flames, their arms outstretched as if embracing the chaos around them. Beneath their feet, a massive demon writhed, its form twisted and grotesque, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. Above them, the Emberstone glowed, its light forming chains that bound the demon to the earth. Cael stepped closer, his breath catching as he realized what he was seeing. This was the first Ember Mage, the one who had given everything to seal the demon away. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, a mix of awe and dread settling in his chest. He could feel the echoes of the mage sacrifice in the air, a tangible reminder of the cost of power. The Emberstone pulsed faintly in his hand, as if responding to the mural's silent call. Before he could process the mural's full meaning, a familiar presence brushed against his mind. The spirit wolf materialized beside him, its golden form shimmering faintly in the dim light. Its amber eyes met his, and for the first time, Kael heard its voice, not in words, but in a cascade of images and emotions. He saw the first Ember Mage standing alone against the demon, their flames burning brighter than the sun. He felt their resolve, their determination to protect the world at any cost. And then he felt their final act, the moment they bound their life force to the Emberstone, sealing the demon away forever. The wolf's gaze bore into him, and the message was clear. Kael was not just the stone's bearer. He was its protector, its guardian. The cycle had begun anew, and the choice was his to make. Kael's hands trembled as he absorbed the weight of the revelation. The flames within him stirred, not with fear or doubt, but with a fierce, unyielding resolve. He could feel the connection between himself and the stone deepening, its power no longer just a tool, but a part of him. But before he could speak, the air grew cold, and a voice cut through the silence like a blade. Such a touching moment. The voice sneered, dripping with mockery. "But tell me, boy, do you truly believe you can withstand what's coming?" Kael turned, his heart pounding, to see a figure step from the shadows. The warlock, Malachar, stood before him, his dark robes swirling with an unnatural energy. His eyes glinted with malice, and his lips curled into a cruel smile. Behind him, the shadows seemed to writhe and twist, forming shapes that made Kael's stomach churn. Malachar raised a hand, and the air around them shimmered, revealing visions of destruction, entire cities consumed by fire, forests reduced to ash, and people fleeing in terror as the demon's shadow loomed over them. "This is what awaits if you cling to that stone," the warlock said, his voice low and smooth, like poison. "You think you can control it. You're a child playing with forces beyond your understanding." Kael's fists clenched, the Emberstone's warmth flaring in response to his anger. He could feel the warlock's words like barbs, digging into his mind, sowing doubt. But beneath the fear, beneath the anger, something else stirred. A stubborn, unyielding determination. "You're wrong," Kael said, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. "I may not understand everything, but I know one thing: this power isn't mine to wield for destruction. It's mine to protect, and I won't let you use it to unleash that demon." Malachar's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of anger. But before he could respond, the spirit wolf stepped forward, its form glowing brighter than ever. The chamber filled with a golden light, and Kael felt the Emberstone's energy surge through him, hot and pure. The warlock's laughter echoed through the sanctum, but it was tinged with something else, unease perhaps, or even fear. "We'll see, boy," he said, his voice fading as the shadows swallowed him. "We'll see how long your resolve lasts." As the light faded, Kael stood alone, the spirit wolf at his side, and the weight of the mural's story pressing down on him. The path ahead was darker than ever, but his resolve burned brighter than the flames within him. He wasn't just a mage anymore. He was the Emberstone's guardian, its protector. And no matter what the warlock threw at him, he would stand firm. The fire in his chest wasn't just a gift. It was a promise, and he intended to keep it. The chamber erupted into chaos as Cael and Malachar faced off, the air crackling with raw energy. The warlock moved with a chilling precision, his dark magic twisting and coiling like a living thing. Kael's flames surged in response, but they felt wilder now, more volatile, as if the Emberstone's power was feeding on his fear and anger. He threw his hands forward, and a torrent of fire roared toward Malachar, but the warlock merely raised a hand, deflecting the flames with a shield of shadow. The force of the rebound sent Cael stumbling back, his chest heaving. The Emberstone's energy pulsed erratically, its warmth shifting between comforting and scorching. Malachar sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can control this power? You're a child playing with fire. Let me show you what real power looks like." With a flick of his wrist, the shadows around him surged forward, forming tendrils that lashed out at Cael. He dodged the first few, but one caught him across the arm, sending a searing pain through his body. The Emberstone flared in response, its light growing brighter, hotter. Cael could feel it pulling at him, demanding more. More energy, more control, more of him. He tried to focus, to channel the stone's power with precision, but it was like trying to hold back a raging river. The flames around him grew hotter, their light shifting from gold to a dangerous, fiery red. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he felt himself slipping, the stone's power threatening to consume him entirely. Malachar pressed his advantage, his attacks growing more relentless. Cael's movements became sluggish, his defenses faltering. He could feel the warlock's magic closing in, the shadows tightening like a noose. Just as despair began to creep in, a flash of light cut through the darkness. Lyra stepped into the chamber, her hands glowing with a soft, silvery light. She moved with a grace and confidence that was almost otherworldly, her magic weaving through the air like threads of moonlight. "Malachar," she called, her voice sharp and commanding. "You've forgotten something." The warlock turned, his expression shifting from triumph to irritation. "You," he spat, "always meddling where you don't belong." Lyra didn't respond. Instead, she raised her hands, and a cascade of light erupted from her fingertips, forming a barrier between Cael and the warlock. The shadows recoiled, hissing like living creatures. Cael felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The Emberstone's power was still raging within him, its energy threatening to spiral out of control. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself, but the flames were everywhere, in his hands, in his chest, in his mind. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady. "Cael, listen to me. The stone's power is a part of you, but it doesn't control you. Focus on what you're fighting for, not what you're fighting against." Her words struck a chord, pulling him back from the edge. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. The flames around him began to shift, their light growing steadier, more controlled. Malachar let out a growl of frustration, his attention divided between Cael and Lyra. "Enough of this," he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. He raised his hands, and the shadows surged forward, but Lyra was ready. Her magic met his in a burst of light and darkness, the two forces colliding with a deafening roar. In that moment, Cael saw his chance. The Emberstone's energy surged through him, but this time it felt different, more focused, more deliberate. He stepped forward, his movement steady, and unleashed a concentrated blast of fire, the flames burning with a pure, golden light. The blast struck Malachar head-on, sending him staggering back. The warlock's expression twisted in fury, but before he could retaliate, Lyra moved in, her magic forming a barrier that pinned him in place. Cael didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, the Emberstone's light blazing in his hand, and with a final, decisive strike, he sent the warlock crashing to the ground. The shadows around Malachar dissipated, leaving him gasping and weakened. For a moment, the chamber was silent, the only sound the crackle of fading flames. Cael stood over the fallen warlock, his chest heaving, the Emberstone's energy still pulsing faintly in his chest. Lyra stepped to his side, her expression unreadable. "It's not over," she said quietly. "He'll come back. They always do." Cael nodded, the weight of her words settling over him, but for now, the battle was won. And as he looked down at the Emberstone, its light steady and warm, he knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, he would face it with the flames of his own resolve burning brighter than ever. The chamber fell silent, save for the faint crackle of fading flames and the heavy rhythm of Cael's breathing. Malachar lay motionless, his dark form crumpled like a discarded shadow. For a moment, Cael allowed himself to believe it was over, that the warlock's threat had been vanquished. But as he turned to Lyra, her expression told a different story. The air around them began to shift, a low hum resonating through the ancient stones of the temple. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and Cael felt a cold dread settle in his chest. High above, the mural of the first Ember Mage began to crack, the chains binding the demon glowing faintly before flickering out. Lyra's eyes widened. "The seal," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "The battle damaged it. The demon's prison is weakening." Before Cael could respond, a familiar presence brushed against his mind. The spirit wolf materialized beside him, its golden form flickering like a dying flame. Its amber eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, its voice came not as images or emotions, but as clear, resonant words. "The seal must be reforged," it said, its tone heavy with finality. "But to do so, you must sacrifice the Emberstone. Its light is the only power strong enough to bind the demon once more." Cael's heart sank, his grip tightening around the stone. Sacrifice it. The Emberstone wasn't just a relic. It was a part of him. Its warmth had been his constant companion, its power the source of his strength. To give it up felt like tearing out a piece of himself. Lyra stepped closer, her expression softening. "I know this isn't easy," she said gently, "but if the demon escapes, everything we fought for will be destroyed." The stone's power was never meant to be kept. It was meant to protect. This is what it was made for. The weight of her words pressed down on him, mingling with the spirit wolf's silent plea. Cael looked down at the Emberstone, its light pulsing faintly, as if it knew what was being asked of it. He could feel its energy, steady and warm, a reminder of the bond they shared. But the temple's trembling grew stronger, the air thick with the scent of sulfur and decay. In the distance, a low, guttural roar echoed through the halls, sending a shiver down his spine. The demon was stirring, its prison crumbling with every passing moment. Cael closed his eyes, his mind racing. To give up the stone meant losing the power he'd worked so hard to master. But to keep it meant risking the world he was sworn to protect. The choice before him wasn't just about duty. It was about who he was, who he wanted to be. The spirit wolf stepped forward, its golden form flickering faintly. The first Ember Mage made this choice long ago, it said, its voice resonating with ancient wisdom. They gave everything to seal the demon away. Now the burden falls to you. Kael's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening. He thought of the mural, of the mage who had stood alone against the darkness, their flames burning brighter than the sun. He thought of the villagers in Ember Hollow, of the spirit wolf's unwavering trust, of Lyra's quiet strength. They had all placed their faith in him. With a deep breath, he opened his eyes and looked down at the Emberstone. Its light seemed to dim, as if it understood what was coming. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. "This isn't about me, it's about protecting what matters." Lyra's hand rested on his shoulder, a silent gesture of support. The spirit wolf bowed its head, its amber eyes glowing with approval. The ground shook violently as Cael stepped forward, the Emberstone held high. Its light flared to life, brighter than ever, illuminating the chamber with a golden glow. He could feel its energy surging through him, not as a wild, untamed force, but as a steady, purposeful power. The demon's roar echoed through the temple, its shadowy form clawing at the edges of the crumbling seal. Cael took a deep breath, his voice ringing out with a strength he didn't know he possessed. "By the light of the Emberstone," he declared, "I bind you once more." The stone shattered in his hands, its light exploding outward in a blinding wave. The demon's roar turned to a deafening shriek as the golden chains reformed, stronger than ever, binding it to the earth. The temple trembled, the air filled with the sound of cracking stone and rushing wind. When the light faded, the chamber was silent. The Emberstone was gone, its power spent, but the seal was whole once more. Cael sank to his knees, his chest heaving, his hands empty. The spirit wolf stood beside him, its golden form flickering faintly. "You've done what few could," it said, its voice filled with quiet reverence. "Your legacy will be remembered." Lyra knelt beside him, her expression a mix of pride and sorrow. "You gave up everything," she said softly, "but you saved us all." Cael looked up at the mural, now restored, the image of the first Ember Mage, standing tall and resolute. He felt a pang of loss, but beneath it was something else, a sense of peace. The flames within him were gone, but the fire of his resolve burned brighter than ever. As he rose to his feet, the weight of his choice settled over him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the strength he'd found within himself. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The Emberstone's light was gone, but its legacy, and his, would endure. The moment the Emberstone shattered, its golden light surged outward in a radiant wave, engulfing the chamber in a brilliance that seemed to blot out the world. Cael's hands trembled as he watched the stone dissolve into shimmering fragments, its warmth slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. A deep ache settled in his chest, not just from the physical loss of the stone, but from the bond they shared, the power that had become a part of him. Yet, even as the weight of that loss pressed down on him, something else began to rise, a quiet, undeniable peace. The demon's guttural roar faded into silence, its shadowy form bound once more by chains of golden light. The air itself seemed to sigh in relief, the oppressive tension lifting as the seal stabilized. But the temple, ancient and fragile, could not withstand the surge of energy. A deep rumble echoed through the chamber, the walls trembling as cracks spider-webbed across the stone. Lyra grabbed Kael's arm, her voice urgent. "We need to go, now." Cael hesitated, his eyes lingering on the mural of the first Ember Mage. The figure's outstretched arms seemed to hold the weight of the world, their flames a testament to sacrifice and resolve. In that moment, he understood their stories were now intertwined, their choices echoing across the ages. The ground beneath them shook violently, chunks of stone raining down from the ceiling. Lyra pulled him toward the exit, her movements swift and determined. Cael stumbled after her, his legs heavy with exhaustion, but his mind clear. The corridors they had navigated before now seemed foreign, twisted by the temple's collapse. Shadows danced wildly as the walls crumbled, the air thick with dust and the acrid scent of burning stone. As they ran, the spirit wolf appeared beside them, its golden form flickering faintly. It moved with a grace that defied the chaos, guiding them through the labyrinth of collapsing halls. Cael's breath came in ragged gasps, his body protesting every step, but he pushed forward, driven by the instinct to survive, and the knowledge that they had succeeded. The temple's entrance loomed ahead, a sliver of daylight piercing through the darkness. Cael's heart leapt as they burst into the open air, the cool breeze a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the collapsing ruins. Behind them, the temple gave one final, thunderous groan before collapsing in on itself, a cloud of dust and debris rising into the sky. Cael sank to his knees, his chest heaving, his hands still tingling with the ghost of the Emberstone's warmth. Lyra stood beside him, her expression a mix of relief and quiet pride. "You did it," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken gratitude. The spirit wolf lingered for a moment, its amber eyes meeting Cael's. "The stone's light is gone," it said, its voice resonant yet gentle, "but its legacy lives on in you. Remember that." With those final words, the wolf's form dissolved into golden motes, carried away by the wind. Cael watched it go, a bittersweet ache settling in his chest. The Emberstone's power had been a part of him, but now he carried something else, its purpose, its responsibility. Lyra knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "What happens now?" she asked, her tone thoughtful. Cael looked out over the forest, the sunlight filtering through the trees in golden beams. The world felt quieter, calmer, as if the earth itself was breathing a sigh of relief. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. "But whatever comes next, I'll face it. Not because I have to, but because I choose to." The words felt right, like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. The Emberstone was gone, but its light had ignited something within him, a resolve that no darkness could extinguish. As he rose to his feet, the weight of the stone's absence still lingering, he felt a strange sense of freedom. The path ahead was his to forge, and for the first time, he was ready to walk it. The forest outside the temple was alive with the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds, a stark contrast to the chaos they just escaped. Cael sat on a fallen log, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the ground where the Emberstone's light had once pulsed in his palm. The weight of its absence was still fresh, a hollow ache that lingered like a phantom limb. Lyra stood a few paces away, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the temple's ruins lay hidden beneath a veil of dust and smoke. She broke the silence first, her voice softer than usual. "I owe you an explanation," she said, turning to face him. "When I first sought the Emberstone, it wasn't to protect the world. It was for power, for myself. I thought it would make me unstoppable." Kael looked up, surprised by her candor. Her admission hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, as if the weight of the temple's collapse had stripped away any pretense. "But seeing you," she continued, her tone tinged with regret, "seeing what you were willing to sacrifice, I realized I was wrong. The stone wasn't meant to be controlled or hoarded. It was meant to protect, to serve something greater than any one person." Her words settled between them, a bridge of understanding forged in the aftermath of their shared struggle. Kael nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the forest around them. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. "The stone wasn't just power, it was a responsibility. And maybe letting it go was the only way to truly honor what it stood for." Before Lyra could respond, a faint glow appeared at the edge of the clearing. The spirit wolf stepped into view, its golden form shimmering faintly in the dappled sunlight. Its amber eyes held a quiet intensity as it approached Kael, its presence commanding yet gentle. "You've proven yourself worthy," it said, its voice resonating with an ancient authority. "The Emberstone may be gone, but its legacy lives on in you. You are the true Ember Mage, not because of the stone, but because of the fire within you, the resolve to stand against darkness, no matter the cost." Kael's breath caught in his throat, the words echoing in his mind like a distant drumbeat. The title felt heavy, yet fitting, a recognition of the journey he'd undertaken and the choices he'd made. He wasn't just a mage anymore. He was something more, a guardian, a protector, a beacon for those who might one day face the shadows. Lyra stepped forward, her expression softening. "You've earned this," she said, her voice carrying a note of respect. "And if you'll have me, I'd like to stand by your side, not for power, but for the chance to make things right." The offer surprised him, but it also felt right. They'd fought side by side, faced impossible odds, and come out stronger for it. Kael nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I think I'd like that," he said. The spirit wolf's form began to fade, its golden light dissolving into the air like embers carried on the wind. "Remember," it said, its voice growing faint, "the flame within you is eternal. Let it guide you, and you will never walk in darkness." As the wolf's presence faded, Kael felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The forest around them seemed to hum with life, the sunlight filtering through the trees like a gentle reminder of the world they'd fought to protect. Lyra broke the silence with a quiet laugh, her tone lighter now. "So," she said, a playful glint in her eye, "what does an Ember Mage do now that the stone's gone?" Kael chuckled, the sound surprising even himself. "I guess we figure it out together," he said, standing and brushing the dirt from his hands. As they walked away from the clearing, the weight of the past felt a little lighter, the path ahead a little clearer. The Emberstone's light was gone, but its purpose lived on, not in a relic, but in the choices they made, the lives they touched, and the fire that burned within them. And for the first time, Cael felt ready to carry that flame forward, not as a burden, but as a beacon. As Cael and Lyra approached Ember Hollow, the familiar sights of the village brought a flood of memories. The cobblestone streets, the thatched rooftops, and the warm glow of lanterns flickering in the evening light. It all felt so unchanged, yet so different. The villagers had gathered in the square, their faces alight with joy and relief. When they spotted Cael, a cheer rose up, the sound of it carrying through the crisp autumn air like a wave of gratitude. Children ran up to him, their laughter ringing out as they tugged at his cloak, asking if it was true, if he'd really saved them all. Adults clapped him on the back, their words filled with praise and awe. Cael smiled, nodding politely, but beneath the surface, a quiet unease stirred. He wasn't the boy they remembered, the one who'd once hidden from his own power, afraid of what it might mean. The Emberstone was gone, and with it, the weight of its expectations. But in its place was something new, a sense of purpose, yes, but also a lingering question. Who was he now? The elder stepped forward, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "You've done well, Cael," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of wisdom. "The village owes you more than we can ever repay." Cael met his gaze, the words of gratitude settling awkwardly in his chest. "I only did what I had, too," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. The elder studied him for a moment, his sharp eyes seeming to pierce through the surface. "You've changed," he said finally. "The boy who left is not the man who returned." "And that's as it should be, but the path ahead is still long, and there is much you have yet to learn." Cael frowned, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" The elder gestured toward the horizon, where the forest stretched endlessly into the distance. "The world is vast, and there are others like you, mages who have mastered their craft, who understand the balance of power and responsibility. Seek them out, learn from them. The Emberstone may be gone, but the fire within you still burns. Let it guide you, but do not let it consume you." The words lingered in Cael's mind, their meaning sinking in slowly. He'd thought his journey was over, that the sacrifice of the stone marked an end. But now he saw it for what it truly was, a beginning. The idea of seeking out other mages, of continuing to grow and learn, filled him with both excitement and trepidation. Lyra stepped up beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. "It's not a bad idea," she said, her tone thoughtful. "There's strength in numbers and wisdom in shared experience." "Besides," she added with a faint smile, "I've always wanted to see more of the world." Cael glanced at her, a flicker of gratitude warming his chest. He wasn't sure what the future held, but knowing he wouldn't face it alone made the uncertainty a little easier to bear. As the celebrations continued around them, Cael found himself stepping back, his gaze drifting to the stars above. The night sky stretched endlessly, a vast tapestry of light and shadow. Somewhere out there were answers, challenges, and perhaps even more questions. But for the first time, he felt ready to face them not as a boy afraid of his own power, but as a man who understood the weight of his choices. The elder's words echoed in his mind, a quiet reminder of the journey ahead. The fire within him still burned, and it was time to let it light the way. The morning sun rose over Ember Hollow, casting a golden glow across the village as Cael and Lyra prepared to depart. A small crowd had gathered to see them off, their faces a mix of pride and worry. The elder stood at the front, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression thoughtful. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "The world beyond these woods is vast and unpredictable. Trust your instincts, but never stop learning." Cael nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon, where the forest gave way to open fields and distant mountains. The weight of the elder's words settled over him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the journey ahead. He adjusted the strap of his satchel, feeling the absence of the Emberstone's familiar warmth. It was strange, carrying nothing but the echoes of its power, yet he felt more prepared than ever. Lyra stepped up beside him, her cloak billowing slightly in the breeze. "Ready?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes serious. "Ready," Cael replied, his voice steady. Their journey began quietly, the forest path familiar and comforting. But as the hours passed, the landscape began to change. The dense woods gave way to rolling hills, their golden grasses swaying in the wind. The air grew crisper, carrying the faint scent of distant rivers and unfamiliar soil. It wasn't long before they encountered their first fellow traveler, a mage who introduced himself as Taran. His robes were a deep, earthy green, and his staff was carved with intricate runes that glowed faintly in the sunlight. "You're the Ember Mage," Taran said, his tone more curious than surprised. "I've heard the stories. They say you faced the warlock and sealed the demon away." Cael exchanged a glance with Lyra, unsure of how much to share. "I did what I had, too," he said carefully. Taran nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The world needs more like you," he said. "There are forces stirring, old and new, that threaten the balance. If you're seeking knowledge, I can guide you to the Circle of Elders. They've been watching the signs for years." The offer was tempting, but Cael hesitated. "What kind of signs?" "The kind that suggest the demon's prison isn't as secure as we'd hoped," Taran replied, his tone grave. "The Circle believes there's more to the prophecy than we've been told. If you're willing, they can help you understand your role in what's to come." Lyra stepped forward, her sharp gaze fixed on Taran. "And what's in it for you?" Taran smiled faintly. "A chance to protect the balance," he said, "and maybe to learn something from the Ember Mage himself." The encounter left Cael with more questions than answers, but it also gave him a sense of direction. The Circle of Elders sounded like the kind of place where he might find the knowledge he sought, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Taran's offer came with strings attached. As they continued their journey, the landscape shifted again, the hills giving way to rocky cliffs and jagged outcroppings. The air grew cooler, carrying the faint tang of salt from the distant sea. It was here, in the shadow of a towering cliff, that they met their next challenge. A figure stepped out from behind a boulder, her robes a deep crimson that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. Her eyes were sharp, her expression unreadable, but the staff in her hand crackled with barely contained energy. "So, the Ember Mage has finally emerged," she said, her voice smooth but laced with an edge of mockery. "I've been waiting for you." Cael tensed, his instincts on high alert. "Who are you?" "Call me Sariel," she replied, her lips curving into a faint smile. "And I'm here to test whether the stories about you are true." Before Cael could respond, Sariel raised her staff, and the air around them crackled with energy. A bolt of crimson lightning shot toward them, forcing Cael to dive to the side. Lyra was already moving, her hands glowing with silvery light as she countered Sariel's attack. The battle was brief but intense, a clash of raw power and precision. Cael's flames surged to life, their golden light cutting through the crimson energy. But Sariel was fast, her movements fluid and unpredictable. It wasn't until Lyra managed to pin her with a burst of moonlight that the fight ended. Sariel straightened, her expression unruffled despite her defeat. "Not bad," she said, her tone almost approving, "but you'll need more than raw power to face what's coming." With that, she vanished in a swirl of crimson light, leaving Cael and Lyra standing in the shadow of the cliff, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The encounter left Cael shaken but determined. Each step of their journey brought new challenges, new allies, and new adversaries. The world was far more complex than he'd ever imagined, and the weight of his role as the Ember Mage felt heavier with every passing day. But as they pressed on, the horizon stretching endlessly before them, Cael couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was also filled with possibility. And for the first time, he felt ready to embrace it not as a burden, but as a calling. The fire within him still burned, and it was time to let it light the way. The city of Ashvale rose before them like a maze of stone and shadow, its towering spires piercing the sky, and its streets teeming with life. The air was thick with the scent of spices and smoke, the clamor of merchants hawking their wares blending with the hum of distant conversations. For Cael, the city was both overwhelming and exhilarating, a stark contrast to the quiet forests and villages he'd known. Yet beneath the surface of its vibrant energy, something darker seemed to pulse, a subtle undercurrent of unease that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Lyra nudged him, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. "Stay close," she murmured. "Cities like this have a way of swallowing people whole." As they navigated the labyrinth of alleys and market squares, Cael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't just the curious glances of passers-by. There was something deliberate about the way certain figures lingered in the shadows, their gazes sharp and calculating. Their first clue came in the form of a whispered rumor, overheard in a dimly lit tavern. A group of cloaked figures had been seen gathering in the city's underbelly, their meetings shrouded in secrecy and marked by strange symbols scrawled on the walls. The descriptions were vague, but one detail stood out, the symbol of a flame encircled by chains. Cael's stomach turned. It was the same symbol he'd seen in the temple, the one that represented the Emberstone seal. The trail led them deeper into the city, where the sunlight struggled to penetrate the narrow streets, and the air grew heavy with the scent of damp stone. They found the cult's hideout in an abandoned warehouse, its windows boarded up and its door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning herbs, and the walls were adorned with the same symbols from the temple. At the center of the room stood a figure cloaked in crimson, their back turned as they examined a map spread across a table. When they turned, Cael's breath caught. It was a woman, her features sharp and her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold, calculating gleam. "So, the Ember Mage has found us," she said, her voice smooth and dripping with mockery. I've been expecting you. Cael stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. Who are you? Call me Isolde, she replied, her tone almost playful. And you've arrived just in time to witness the beginning of something extraordinary. Before Cael could respond, Lyra stepped in, her voice sharp and commanding. If you're planning to resurrect the demon, you're in for a rude awakening. The Emberstone seal is intact. Isolde laughed, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse. Is it? Then why do I feel its prison weakening with every passing day? The Emberstone's destruction may have saved you once, but it also left the seal vulnerable. The demon stirs, and soon it will rise again. Her words struck Cael like a blow, the weight of their meaning settling heavily in his chest. The Emberstone's absence wasn't just a loss, it was a ticking clock, a countdown to disaster. Isolde stepped closer, her gaze locked on Cael. You have a choice, Ember Mage. Join us, and together, we can harness the demon's power, or stand against us, and watch as the world burns. Cael's fists tightened, the flames within him flickering in response to his rising anger. I'll never join you, he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Isolde's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold disdain. A shame, she said, her voice dripping with venom. But I suppose every hero needs a villain. With a flick of her wrist, the room erupted into chaos. Cultists emerged from the shadows, their movements unnervingly coordinated. Cael and Lyra fought back, their combined magic cutting through the onslaught, but the sheer number of enemies forced them to retreat. As they fled the warehouse, Cael's mind raced. Isolde's words echoed in his head, a grim reminder of the stakes they faced. The demon's prison was weakening, and without the Emberstone, they had no way to restore the seal. Lyra grabbed his arm, her expression grim. We need to find the circle of elders, she said urgently. If anyone knows how to stop this, it's them. Cael nodded, though the weight of their task felt heavier than ever. The city's chaos faded into the background as they pressed on, their path uncertain, but their resolve unshaken. The fire within him still burned, but now, more than ever, he understood its purpose. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a beacon, a light to guide them through the darkness. And as they disappeared into the labyrinth of Ashvale streets, the shadows seemed to close in behind them, a silent reminder of the battle yet to come. The journey to find the elemental shards began with a whisper, a faint, almost imperceptible hum that Cael felt in the air as they left the chaos of Ashvale behind. It was as if the land itself was calling to him, guiding him toward the remnants of the Emberstone's power. Lyra walked beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon, her expression a mix of determination and quiet curiosity. The first shard lay hidden in the heart of the Whispering Marsh, a place where the air was thick with fog and the ground seemed to shift beneath their feet. The marsh was alive with strange, otherworldly sounds, cries that might have been birds or something far more unsettling. Cael could feel the shard's energy pulling at him, a faint warmth cutting through the damp chill. As they waded through the murky waters, the marsh seemed to resist them. Vines snaked out to tangle their feet, and shadows moved just out of sight, their shapes indistinct but menacing. Cael's flames flickered to life, their golden light cutting through the gloom, but the marsh wasn't just testing his magic, it was testing his resolve. At the center of the marsh, they found the shard embedded in a twisted tree, its surface glowing with a soft, greenish light. But as Cael reached for it, the air around him shifted, and he was pulled into a vision. He stood in Ember Hollow, but it wasn't the village he remembered. The streets were empty, the houses crumbling, and the sky was a sickly shade of gray. The Emberstone was gone, and in its place was a gaping void, a darkness that seemed to devour everything it touched. The vision shifted, and he saw himself standing alone, the flames in his hands sputtering and dying as shadows closed in around him. The shard's voice echoed in his mind, soft but insistent. "What are you afraid of?" Cael's breath caught, the weight of the vision pressing down on him. He wasn't just afraid of failure, he was afraid of being powerless, of watching everything he cared about crumble and not being able to stop it. The shard's light pulsed faintly, as if waiting for his answer. "I'm afraid of not being enough," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The shard's light flared, and the vision dissolved, leaving him standing in the marsh once more. The shard floated into his hand, its warmth steady and reassuring. Lyra watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "What did you see?" she asked quietly. Cael hesitated, the weight of the vision still fresh in his mind. "A future I don't want to face," he said finally. The second shard led them to the Stormspire Mountains, where the air was thin and the wind howled like a living thing. The shard's energy was sharp and electric, crackling in the air like a storm about to break. They found it perched on a narrow ledge, its surface pulsing with a faint blue light. But the shard wasn't unguarded. A massive creature, part eagle and part lion, stood between them and the shard, its golden eyes gleaming with intelligence. It let out a deafening cry, the sound echoing off the mountainside. Cael stepped forward, his flames flickering to life, but the creature didn't attack. Instead it spoke, its voice deep and resonant. "Prove your worth, mage." The challenge wasn't physical, it was a test of wisdom. The creature posed a riddle, its words layered with meaning. Cael's mind raced as he tried to unravel the answer, the shard's energy humming faintly in the background. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady. "The answer is balance." The creature studied him for a moment before stepping aside, its massive form disappearing into the mist. The shard floated into his hand, its energy sharper and more focused than before. By the time they reached the third shard, Cael's confidence had grown, but so had his unease. Each shard seemed to peel back another layer of his fears and doubts, forcing him to confront the parts of himself he'd rather ignore. The final shard lay hidden in the ruins of an ancient city, its streets overgrown with vines and its buildings crumbling into dust. The shard's energy was faint, almost imperceptible, but Cael could feel it pulling at him, a faint warmth in the cold, lifeless air. As they approached the shard, the air around them shifted, and they were surrounded by shadowy figures, echoes of the past, their forms twisted and distorted. They whispered accusations, their voices low and venomous. "You'll fail," they hissed. "You'll destroy everything you love." Cael's flames flickered, but he forced himself to focus, to push past the doubt and fear. The shard's light grew brighter, its warmth steady and reassuring. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his voice firm. The shadows dissolved and the shard floated into his hand, its light merging with the others. Cael could feel their power, distinct yet harmonious, a reminder of the balance he'd fought so hard to achieve. As they left the ruins, Lyra glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "You've changed," she said. Cael nodded, the weight of the shards steady in his hands. "I had to," he replied. The journey had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but it had also given him something he'd been missing: clarity. The shards weren't just pieces of the Emberstone's power. They were reflections of his own strength, his own resolve, and as they walked away from the ruins, the horizon stretching endlessly before them, Cael felt a flicker of hope. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it, not as a boy afraid of his own power, but as a mage who understood the weight of his choices. The fire within him still burned, and it was time to let it light the way. The journey back to the temple ruins was a quiet one, the weight of the elemental shards pressing heavily on Cael's mind. Each step felt like a march toward an uncertain fate, the air thick with the lingering scent of ash and decay. The once grand ruins loomed ahead, their jagged silhouette cutting through the twilight like a scar on the landscape. The cult had been busy, dark banners hung from the broken walls, and the air crackled with an unsettling energy. Lyra glanced at Cael, her expression unreadable. "This is it," she said quietly. "Once we step inside, there's no turning back." Cael nodded, his grip tightening around the shards. Their combined warmth was a steady presence, a reminder of the power they held. But it wasn't just about the shards anymore. It was about what they represented: balance, sacrifice, hope. The moment they crossed the threshold, the cultists descended. Their movements were swift and coordinated, their dark robes swirling like shadows as they closed in. Cael's flames surged to life, their golden light cutting through the gloom, but the sheer number of enemies forced them to fight defensively. Lyra's magic was a blur of silver and light, her movements precise and deadly. In the center of the chamber stood Isolde, her crimson robes billowing as she channeled the cult's collective energy into the crumbling seal. The demon's shadowy form writhed beneath the surface, its guttural roar shaking the very foundations of the temple. Cael's heart raced as he realized what was at stake. The shards were their only hope, but using them came with a cost. He could feel their power, raw and untamed, pulsing in his hands like a living thing. "Lyra," he called, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I need to get to the seal." She nodded, her expression grim. "Go, I'll hold them off." With Lyra covering him, Cael fought his way to the center of the chamber. The shard's energy grew stronger with every step, their light merging into a brilliant, golden glow. He placed them at the base of the seal, their power resonating with the ancient magic woven into the temple's stones. The process was agonizing. The shard's energy surged through him, tearing at his very essence as he channeled it into the seal. His vision blurred, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The demon's roar grew louder, its shadowy form pressing against the weakened barrier. Just as the seal began to stabilize, Cael felt his strength falter. The shard's power was too much, their energy threatening to consume him entirely. His vision darkened, and he collapsed to his knees, his hands still pressed against the seal. Lyra was at his side in an instant, her hands glowing with the last vestiges of her magic. "I've got you," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. With a final, desperate act, she poured her own magic into him, her silver light merging with the shard's golden glow. The seal flared to life, its chains reforming with a deafening roar. The demon's shadowy form was forced back, its guttural cry fading into silence as the seal stabilized, but the cost was steep. Cael lay unconscious, his breathing shallow, his body drained of all strength. Lyra knelt beside him, her own magic spent, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse. For a moment, the chamber was silent, the weight of their sacrifice hanging heavy in the air. The cultists had fled, their dark banners torn and scattered. The temple's ruins stood still, their jagged walls bathed in the soft glow of the newly reforged seal. Lyra's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. "You did it," she said, her tone a mix of relief and quiet pride. Cael stirred faintly, his eyes fluttering open. The shard's light was gone, their power spent, but the seal held firm. He looked at Lyra, his voice barely above a whisper. "You saved me." She smiled faintly, though her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. We saved each other. As the first rays of dawn broke through the temple's broken walls, Cael and Lyra sat in silence, the weight of their journey settling over them. The fire within him still burned, but it was no longer just his. It was theirs. And as they stepped out of the ruins into the light of a new day, they knew their journey was far from over. The world was still vast, and the shadows still lingered, but for the first time, they felt ready to face whatever came next together. The air in the temple chamber grew still, the echoes of the demon's final roar fading into silence. Cael knelt on the cold stone floor, his hands trembling as the last flickers of golden light from the shards dissolved into the air. The seal above him pulsed faintly, its chains glowing with renewed strength, binding the demon once more. Relief washed over him, but it was tinged with exhaustion, a deep, bone-weary ache that seemed to settle into every fiber of his being. Lyra stood beside him, her silver magic flickering faintly before fading entirely. She sank to the ground, her breathing labored, but her eyes never left the seal. "It's done," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of disbelief and quiet triumph. Before Cael could respond, a familiar warmth filled the chamber. The spirit wolf materialized before them, its golden form shimmering with an ethereal glow. Its amber eyes met Cael's, and for the first time, there was no urgency in its gaze, only a quiet, solemn pride. "You have done what few could," the wolf said, its voice resonant yet gentle. "The seal is reforged, the demon bound. Your journey as the Ember Mage is complete." Cael's heart swelled at the words, but the wolf's next sentence gave him pause. "Yet the shadows are vast, and the light must always be vigilant. Greater challenges await, for the balance of this world is fragile, and the ancient evils are many." The wolf's form began to fade, its golden light dissolving into the air like embers carried on the wind. Before it vanished entirely, it spoke one final time. "Remember, the fire within you is eternal. Let it guide you, and you will never walk in darkness." Cael stared at the spot where the wolf had been, the weight of its words settling over him. He turned to Lyra, her expression a mirror of his own relief, exhaustion, and a flicker of determination. "We've come this far," Cael said, his voice steady despite the weariness in his bones. But this isn't the end, is it? Lyra shook her head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Not even close. The world is full of shadows, and someone has to stand against them. Cael nodded, the resolve in his chest burning brighter than ever. The shards were gone, their power spent, but the flames within him still flickered, not as a wild, untamed force, but as a steady, purposeful light. He reached out, taking Lyra's hand in his. "Then we'll face them together," he said, his tone firm. Lyra's smile widened, her grip tightening around his. Together, as they stepped out of the temple ruins, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The world stretched out before them, vast and full of possibilities. The seal was secure, the demon bound, but the shadows still lingered not just in the ruins, but in every corner of the world. Cael took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling his lungs. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it, not as a boy afraid of his own power, but as a mage who understood the weight of his choices. And as they walked away from the ruins, the horizon stretching endlessly before them, Cael knew one thing for certain: the fire within him was more than a gift. It was a promise to protect, to persevere, and to stand against the darkness, no matter how deep it ran. The path ahead was long, but they would walk it together, their light burning brighter than ever. The journey back to Ember Hollow was a quiet one, the weight of all they had endured settling into the rhythm of their steps. The forest seemed to welcome them, its familiar paths now carrying the echoes of their adventures. As the first rooftops of the village came into view, Cael felt a swell of emotion, relief, pride, and a quiet determination. This place, once a simple home, now held the promise of something greater. The villagers greeted them with a mix of awe and gratitude, their faces lighting up as Cael and Lyra stepped into the square. Children darted forward, their laughter ringing out as they tugged at Cael's cloak, asking for stories of the battles they'd fought and the magic they'd seen. Adults gathered around, their expressions a blend of respect and curiosity. Cael looked around at the faces of the people he'd known all his life, and for the first time, he saw not just a village, but a community, a place where those touched by magic could find safety and belonging. The idea took root in his mind, growing with every passing moment. "We've faced the darkness," Cael said, his voice carrying over the crowd, "and we've proven that light can prevail. But the fight isn't over. The world is still full of shadows, and there are others like us, others who need a place to call home." Lyra stepped forward, her silver eyes scanning the crowd. "Ember Hollow can be that place," she said, her tone steady and resolute. "A sanctuary for mages, for those who wield magic, and for anyone who seeks refuge from the darkness. Together, we can make it stronger, safer, and ready to face whatever comes next." The villagers exchanged glances, their murmurs of agreement growing into a chorus of support. The elder stepped forward, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "You've brought us hope when we needed it most," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of wisdom. "And now you offer us a future. We'll stand with you, Cael. Together, we'll rebuild this village into something greater than it's ever been." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The villagers worked side by side, their hands shaping wood and stone into homes and workshops, their laughter and voices filling the air. Kael and Lyra moved among them, their magic weaving through the efforts like a golden thread, strengthening walls and lighting fires. Kael found himself drawn to the heart of the village, where the remnants of the Emberstone's energy still lingered. He placed his hand on the ground, feeling the faint hum of its power beneath his fingers. Though the stone itself was gone, its legacy lived on, not just in the seal they had reforged, but in the people who carried its light within them. As the sun set on the newly rebuilt village, Cael stood at its center, the flickering light of lanterns casting long shadows across the square. Lyra joined him, her presence steady and reassuring. "You've come a long way," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. From a boy afraid of his own power to a mage who stands as a beacon of hope. "The Emberstone may be gone, but its light lives on in you." Cael smiled, the warmth of her words settling over him like a blanket. "It's not just me," he said, his gaze sweeping over the village. "It's all of us. The stone's legacy isn't just about power. It's about what we do with it. And together, we'll make sure that light never fades." The night grew quiet, the stars above shining brightly in the clear sky. Ember Hollow stood as a testament to resilience and hope, its people united by a shared purpose. The shadows still lingered at the edges of the world, but Cael knew they would face them, not as individuals, but as a community. As he turned to Lyra, her silver eyes reflecting the light of the lanterns, he felt a flicker of excitement for the future. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to embrace it, not as a burden, but as a calling. The fire within him still burned, and it was time to let it light the way.